Good morning, everyone. My name is Suzanne. I am here with the Indiana State Library. I am the supervisor for the Professional Development Office. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the webinar today called Let's Talk, a conversation about information literacy. We are really excited to have Lisa Jarrell and Brenda Yates Haybick here from Ball State University to join us and help us with this conversation about information literacy. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar off with a few announcements. This webinar is provided as part of the Library Trends and Hot Topics series. To register for other webinars available for this series or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at library.in.gov under Services for Libraries. For a full list of our current in-person training menu, please see our continuing education website. As you guys know, the State Library has many ways that we try to stay connected to library staff across the state. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Wednesday Word. We also offer a blog which provides information about our collections, interview spotlights on library staff from across the state, and information about upcoming events at the State Library. I wanted to let you know that we are not experiencing any global sound issues at this time. If we do experience, or if you guys experience any sound issues, be sure to see the sound issues pod beneath your chat box. If we have a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat box, and it will be something that's happening to everyone. A lot of times what we'll have are connection issues on your end, and there's not really a lot that we can do about those kinds of things, but I wanted to just be sure that everyone knows that we are recording today's webinar. So if you need to, take a look at it later, you certainly can. Also, we are going to have an LEU, Library Education Unit, certificate available for download at the end of the webinar. So if you hang on until the very end, you'll be able to download that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Lisa and to Brenda. And if you guys want to go ahead and share your screen so we can see your PowerPoint, that would be great. And I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic and invite you guys to get started. I will unmute as we go to kind of interact with the chat box. We really do want today to be kind of like a conversation. So as Lisa and Brenda are doing their presentation, I really want to invite all of our participants to join in the chat box, and I will be sort of conveying those comments to Lisa and Brenda as we go. Okay?
Okay, sounds great, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming and joining us this morning. Happy Friday. A shout out goes to Jonathan and our end for helping us get this technology up and going, so we appreciate his efforts. We are so glad to see familiar names in the attendees box, so welcome. It's good to see that. Lisa and I, we've been talking about information literacy for 12 years-ish,
right?
But we so want to hear what you guys have to say about this topic. So please just join in as we go along. We certainly don't have all the answers, barely any answers. So we're excited to hear from you guys. So.
Sorry, stand by. Little slide issue there. There we go. So we would put together just a little, can you, hopefully you can read that, okay. That's just some words that we sort of use to talk about information literacy in its various forms. So just to kind of have a jumping off place for what we're doing, we thought we would talk a little bit about our own sort of takes on that sort of work. Brenda and I are both, and I guess I should say this voice is Lisa Jarrell. The other voice is Brenda. We both work in the academic setting, and so we sort of thought we should confess that as our sort of context for this conversation. I work, for many years I worked in information services here at Bracken, so that was sort of a general information literacy for the whole campus. And so I worked with all sorts of students. My focus now is more on teacher education students in information literacy, so that's a whole other sort of seen with regard to working with school librarians and public librarians, and working with teachers in the classroom in that. So it's sort of an interesting take for me, and so I'm interested to hear from you all about what, if you're in a different sort of library, kind of what your take is on information literacy and on students, and on if you work with teachers. That would be sort of interesting to me too. So that's sort of where I'm coming from with this.
And this is Brenda, and I'm coming from information literacy. I work in the same unit that Lisa used to work in. A lot of the students I see are first-time freshmen, but I also work with the Honors College, and those are not necessarily all freshmen. What I've been seeing are a lot of transfer students in our upper level classes, so they have transferred in those beginning classes, and so we're not meeting them at that point, which is a little bit disconcerting for the information literacy, to sort of grow as they're a student here. And I also do a lot of work with graduate level students and faculty. And I've come to realize that information literacy is just as important when you're working with faculty members one-on-one as it is with a class of 25 students. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So what we would like to know is where you're coming from and sort of your work environment and your patrons and what you're seeing.
So if people want to go ahead and chime in the chat box, that would be great. And I'll just go ahead and clarify a couple of things. So Brenda and Julie, the library that you work in is Bracken, right?
It is. We both work in Bracken.
And that's at Ball State University?
Yes, it is.
Right, okay.
And it is the one of 3 libraries on campus. So we have an architecture library and a health science library as well.
That's great. Can you go back to your slide with the words on it for a second?
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that when we talk about information literacy in public libraries, a lot of times we don't actually refer to it as information literacy. We might call it like how to use the library. We might just use something sort of informal like that. But I've also heard people kind of refer to the concept of being a good citizen and like learning how to navigate, just day-to-day citizenry things, like figuring out how to file your taxes, figuring out how to register to vote, all that kind of stuff as being sort of information literacy as well. So I don't know if, how you guys feel about that, if you think that that's true or not. And then I'd be interested to know if we have any school librarians in the K-12 sector here on the webinar today. I'm not sure that we do, but I know that they sometimes they will refer to it as being, good citizenry as well. The other thing, of course, that we talk about in public libraries is lifelong learning. So, that sort of, I guess, falls into this. And sometimes we also talk about digital literacy, which I feel like is sort of maybe a subset of information literacy. So that's just a little bit from me. And our chat box is a little quiet on this question. So I'm just going to prod people to go ahead and let us know, what is information literacy to you? And, what kind of patrons are you working with? Are you working with students? Are you working with members of the public? That kind of thing. And I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you guys.
Okay, thanks. Just while you're prodding, I just wanted to mention that and I know Brenda too, we very rarely say those words information literacy out loud to anyone but librarians. So, and the reason is the same, right? It's because we're talking about a set of skills and a set of sort of thought habits and thought patterns about information. So whether it's registering to vote or whatever it could be, or finding a scholarly article for a paper, like it's all part of that same thing. I do a lot more now with digital literacy than I did before, just because I am working with, future K-12 teachers and working with some technology here in the building. So I think it's all part of the same whole, if that helps anybody.
Sure. And Rachel has made kind of a nice long comment in the chat box. She said that she's from an academic background. They take an informed learning approach to information literacy. She works primarily with subject faculty through a course redesign program. She also works with students, sometimes they're graduate TAs, on how they think about using information to support disciplinary research assignments. Information literacy is how they use information in disciplinary ways in order to learn. We think about being extremely reflective of how our engagements with our information support disciplinary, with how our engagements with information supports disciplinary learning. So it sounds like Rachel has a pretty a specific way of thinking about information literacy. Thank you so much for sharing, Rachel.
This is Brenda, and I love that part in what you responded and how you responded to the fact that you see information literacy as within the context of a discipline. Lisa and I go back and forth about this, about, we don't have the corner market on information literacy, I don't think, personally. And sort of, I think one of the missing words on this, well, it was kind of funny because I was trying to put this word cloud together and I was trying to find a book. And there wasn't an option for the shape of a book, so I went with a heart, and this does not look like a heart to me. But I think one of the missing important words is context.
Yeah.
And so that made my day, Rachel, so thank you for including that.
And then Catherine says that instead of talking about information literacy, they talk about research skills. That's maybe a more accessible, term than information literacy. Rachel also says that they do talk about context a lot. And I should also just mention for everybody on the webinar that Lisa and Brenda cannot actually see the chat box, so that's why I'm going to be reiterating a lot of what you're saying.
Right. Otherwise, we would play talk show host, but we can't see you. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of move off of this slide, and because Brenda and I came up with some questions that might help generate some discussion. So it sounds like people have already responded to where they're coming from. We also have some questions about, are there standards and guidelines? I think Rachel alluded to that a little bit. I know at Purdue, you're at Purdue, yeah, and there's a lot of, I think, structure in terms of that and guidelines there, like there are in most academic settings. But these are just some questions that we thought might generate some discussion. So if you see one that you'd like to respond to, or if there's something that is not on this list that you're interested in talking about today, we'd be happy to hear that. And we'll just give you a couple minutes to kind of read through these and see what jumps out.
So I'm reading. Other people are reading. We have a couple people typing in the chat box.
Yay, typing!
Yay, typing.
We love typing.
Rachel says that she thinks the question about how we know when our patrons get it is really interesting. And I have to agree with her that I think that can be really challenging. And I think it's particularly challenging in a public library when we don't really have the captive audience, I guess, maybe is not a great way to put it, but that you guys have in academia, because whether or not our patrons are learning information literacy or research skills, we really don't have a great way to measure that in public libraries. We can certainly do a lot of sort of scaffolding around that, but it is hard to kind of measure that. I feel like in an academic setting, I know that you guys have a lot of courses that maybe freshmen take where they might actually, I don't know, I guess I have a question for you guys. Do you have a course where you actually teach something called information literacy?
It varies from place to place. We do not.
Mm-hmm.
We do one-shot instruction sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So that part of getting it is always the bug for
Mm-hmm.
us.
Well, and for me, it's always get what? What are they getting? And it's contextual, right? So like if I have somebody who's in a class and they're doing their very first lesson plan, that's really different from a student who's about to be student teaching and is writing something else or doing some other sort of project. So because that can be a different sort of type of research path or whatever. So you never really know, I think, even in an academic library with all of our assessment and all of that. It's really still hard to know.
We do have a few more people typing.
Good.
And I want to, well, we just had a couple other people join us, so I want to just welcome them and let them know that we are sort of conversing right now about what information literacy is. If you have any thoughts on any of the questions on the screen, go ahead and type those in the chat box. And Rachel says that she agrees with Lisa. Getting it can be really different across disciplines and situations. And, I think sometimes for like the public, like you can have a great information literacy moment when you find the right thing you want to buy on Amazon.
Yes.
I love that. I love that.
Yes. Yes.
Joseph says that he's worked in both academic and public libraries now. He certainly saw more research in the academic library because it was a necessity. In the public libraries, he says, I've worked in most of the public libraries he's worked in. Most of the research is geared toward genealogy, which is, yeah, that's a really good point. Research skills, however, do cross over quite a bit. And I think genealogy is a really good example as well because there is a lot of sort of hard and skilled research that can go into genealogy.
Yeah, and very specific types of things that you're asking.
That's a really good example.
Right. So, and I'm curious just to kind of build on that from the public library folks that are with us today, we've kind of shared and the academic librarians have sort of shared our sort of piece of this, but I'm curious to know from you all who do work with the general public, what is that like? And do you have what is that like? I'll just leave it open-ended.
Mm-hmm. We do have a couple more people typing. I'll just weigh in a little bit about public libraries. I think that they can take a really varied approach from putting a lab assistant in a computer lab, I think can sometimes help. Rachel is chiming in and saying that information literacy can take the form of using information to find and apply to jobs. That's a really good example from the public, helping out with taxes, things like that. And I guess that kind of goes along with the almost like digital citizenship or being a good citizen or sort of knowing how to interact with your community in these ways too. Rachel says that she used to work in a public library as well. So I think in public libraries, we do still see maybe like library tours that will happen where people are sort of getting a orientation to the library. I actually just did a webinar on homeschoolers and we were talking about how that's a great service to offer for them because then they can get a look at what sort of resources are there. Also, things like library instruction doesn't really happen in public libraries, but we might have like a how to use the library program, something like that. Vanessa says, in the public library, you often deal with patrons that have different reading levels and understandings, which is very true. We constantly have to find ways to reach the patron. At many of the libraries, we offer computer classes, tinker stations, and job centers. So those are all, another sort of different way of looking at this.
I think that's interesting, the reading levels and maybe even interest levels. This is Brenda. Because what I'm seeing a lot of are students who don't care to read a whole article and they're not seeing that they have to in order to write the research paper at the other end of that. So that's really interesting to me.
And then we do have a children's librarian that chimed in and said that she seems to have there's a lot less research paper needs with, young people. So she's begun to focus on teaching library databases and web searches instead of really focusing so much on research papers. And I think that's a really nice point too, that, if we can teach our younger people how to use databases and web searches, then by the time they get to you guys, they might be a little bit more prepared.
That's a really good point. But I would also be curious, public librarians out there, who, it's one of the questions here, what do you wish our students, our patrons, knew when they come to you that they don't know?
Can you clarify that a little bit? Which question is that?
This is Brenda. So if we have college students that are home or going to their nearby public library to do some work, what is it that they're not comfortable with or don't know when they get to that public library setting and how to use it?
That's a great question. We're getting crickets right now. Oh no, Jeanette or Janine, I'm sorry, is gonna weigh in on this.
That was a heavy question.
It
Yeah,
was. It's
we have a
good
couple
for
people that
Friday
are
morning.
weighing in. You know, this sounds so basic, but one of the things that we help people with a lot of in public libraries is literally still, creating an account and finding
Yeah,
your
that's
password
great.
and all of those kinds of things. And I think that's a little bit more about digital literacy than it is maybe about information literacy, but I still think those things go hand in hand.
I agree.
And Janine agrees. She says that she worked at another public library that had a lot of adult college learners who didn't know very much about using computers. Um, yeah, and Rachel says that she doesn't think that should be diminished, and I agree. I think that digital literacy skills really, I mean, we talk about the digital gap in our country, and I think that that's a real thing. And sometimes I also think that we assume that digital natives are good at computers, that they're like born that way, and they're not necessarily. Just because they've been using devices all their life, it doesn't mean that they are savvy about it.
Right.
Right.
Well, and we struggle with that here at Ball State too, because we have students who have a lot of screen time as little kids, but they don't really know how to do anything on that screen as an adult, anything productive, and so we're trying to sort of help with that. And the other thing that I think, and I think about this more in my job now than I used to, is we can't assume that everybody has access to the same level of technology or internet speed or any of that. And so that sort of comes into play here as well.
Joseph says in public libraries, they often help adults with basic computer skills in addition to research skills. And we have a lot of other attendees typing. Rachel says, especially when you're just creating an account or learning how to access documents from the cloud, that's something that I'm sure we work with a lot in the public libraries as well. Helping them navigate their own personal information, it can help them be more independent in the future when they need to use it for particular purposes. I mean, I'm sure that all of us have a parent that's like, still struggling with digital photographs on their telephone. I just said telephone. I meant cell phone. Um,
Too.
yeah, and Vanessa says it does depend on the library. They have 24 libraries in their system. So depending on the branch, the patrons are different. What she finds is that students that come here don't know how to narrow their searches to get the best result. So that's another.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I do
It's a
just
struggle
want
to have
I did just
too.
want to chime in and say that we're 20 minutes in, so I'm not sure what other content you guys want to get to, but we do have a lot of activity in the chat box, which is great.
That's great. No,
That's good.
we're
Keep
happy
going.
to talk the whole time. We have a few little slides at the end that just sort of wrap things up, but we're in no hurry to get done. So
Great. Okay, great. Um, yeah, so we're actually quiet now, so I think that's kind of where we're at there. Do you have any of these questions that you want to kind of answer about Ball State?
I think, well,
Maybe.
yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit. I know in the academic library realm, there's been a lot of chatter in the last few years about sort of the guidelines for information literacy that we have and that we all sort of use to work with students and faculty. And so there's some of that we were going to talk about at the end. The other thing that we sort of wanted to cover a little bit was sort of the overlap and this conflation I think that happens with the internet and then the proprietary database stuff. And we still have students who tend not to know that there's a difference between something that is subscribed to by a library and something that is Googleable on the web. So that's something that we talk about a lot. And I think for me, especially particularly with teachers, our future teachers, there's a lot of this, oh, everything is on, all the stuff's on Pinterest, right? Mm-hmm. Every teacher has a Pinterest board and they're all out there doing these things. And so we have to talk about, but what about the content that you're teaching and how do you find out about, the Mounds Indians if you haven't thought about them in a long time? So that sort of thing happens here as well.
And sort of building on that, this is Brenda. As far as using Google, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about, they've had a lot of screen time, but what do they do with that? And some of the things that they just aren't comfortable doing. And in terms of using Google and searching it effectively, I'm still surprised at the students who don't know how to or aren't clear about using Google Scholar and searching with certain extensions on various websites and sort of that use it wisely approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if this is something that is also playing out in the public libraries when you're working with patrons and they're on the Google. Is it just a free-for-all, or is there some, and I guess context matters, that very important word that keeps rearing its head this morning. So what are you seeing in terms of folks who are on Google doing their thing?
Well, and I think that another thing to consider is that the tools that we have to use keep changing. And I think that that can be really frustrating from a public perspective, where you get to know, how to upload something to your Dropbox account automatically and you have it set up, and then you get a new phone and that system is gone or that system has changed and you have to redo it. And sometimes that can happen more frequently than we're really comfortable with. Technology is just changing really quickly, and I think that sometimes people kind of throw up their hands and are like, "Well, I don't want to learn this new thing because I had the old thing figured out, and it took me a year to figure that out, and now it's changing again." So I think that can be something to consider as well. It's just that, in libraries we talk a lot about staying up on trends and trying to make sure we know what's going on, but our public don't necessarily feel like, like that's something that they're going to prioritize. And I feel like even teaching how to be nimble with data and with information is really important. Janine says, not only is everything Googled, but patrons and students don't think about the source and the authority of a random website versus a database. And that's absolutely true. Of course, we all know in the news there's a lot of information right now about fake news and things like that. We did another webinar specifically on fake news, and I think that goes hand in hand with this topic. Rachel says that she thinks helping them become aware of the processes and the similarities between platforms and tools can be helpful for navigating changes and all the different options. And an example of that, I think, is like narrowing a search in Amazon is really similar to narrowing a search using a database, and so if you can show it in something that they really connect to or can relate to, that I think is easier to find a transferable skill when you're working on a database.
It's funny, I've been using that as an example this semester, buying those fabulous black boots.
I use Zappos all the time.
Must narrow down.
We have a discovery layer, which is something that I think we can probably all maybe talk about too. And I don't know how popular that may be in the public library realm, but we have it's essentially a tool that sort of mushes all of our results together from the catalog and from databases and from our any kind of digital collection that we might have here at Ball State, and it kind of spits out all the results together in a huge list for students based on their search. And again, it's that idea of, I'm looking for stuff about Native Americans, so that's what I type in the box. And so that's one of the things I do all the time is say, pretend you're on Zappos. How high do you want the heel of your shoe? What color should it be? Or whatever, or Amazon. What am I looking for? Is it sports equipment? Is it, whatever. So that helps a lot to sort of make that parallel for them.
Mm-hmm. Vanessa says that just yesterday, and I think she's commenting on what I was saying about how things change and how sometimes we reach a learning threshold and we're like, I don't want to learn another new thing. I've been learning all this stuff. So she said she had a patron yesterday that needed help on WordPress, and she suggested that she try Wix or try a different tool for her website, but the patron didn't want to start over. She's already sort of been working on WordPress. And I think that's another sort of barrier that we have to think about, is trying to find the ways to help them where they are, I guess. And Janine says that she does love using a favorite website as an example to help narrow down a search. And also, if you think about narrowing searches in Netflix, and I will say, I think Netflix has a terrible index. I can never really find what I want when I'm searching in them. But, that's another sort of place where people are trying to find a specific thing a lot of times. And I feel like you guys had a question, and I don't know that we answered it. What was the last question that you guys had?
We had? Oh, we talked about it, I think. I was asking just about sort of what the information literacy sort of needs are in the public library. And I sort of expected that they were similar to ours, but
it's nice to confirm that.
Yeah,
and definitely. To sort of let your brain wrestle with it a little bit. Yeah, and it's interesting too that I forget who chatted back about the sort of being to evaluate your sources, and so that's sort of a nice lead into where we're headed here.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Here at in the academic libraries, we are using the framework for information literacy, but there's a lot of ideas and terms that have been bandied about this morning that show up here as well. So I think there is a lot of overlap, and just having this discussion, I think, is bringing that forward and making it more clear to me personally.
Right.
So yeah.
And so you see there under frames, just the sort of is there 5 or 6 now? There's 6. A sort of ideas that we try to get across to students when we work with them, whether it's in class or one-on-one or whatever. And so this is sort of where we're coming from as academic librarians. This idea of authority is constructed, and there's that word again, contextual, right? So we talk about how you might need an article written by an expert, or you might need some opinion pieces, or you might need, something else. And so that authority of your source is contextual and constructed by, the community you're talking to, or by, the person that is reading it, right? So there's a lot of variance there. We talk about the process of creating information, too, and how information kind of appears in the world. So that's kind of another piece of that.
And sort of building on that, how it's different in the academic setting versus Google.
Your real life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and how those processes are not the same.
I think that's really interesting, that the point that information creation as a process, because a lot of our students in the K-12 sector are actually content creators. My stepdaughter was just doing a project the other day, and she was grabbing images off the internet, and of course there was a big no, stop, you need to cite your sources at our house. But I can't imagine that happens, at every house.
It happens in our house too.
Yeah. I mean, it happens in librarians' houses, but this idea that when you are creating information, having a good basis for that is really important. And I also do want to sort of back you guys up a little bit. Tell us what ACRL means. We have some public librarians on here that might not even know.
Oh, yeah. That's the Association of College and Research Librarians. It's part of ALA. So that's our sort of, I don't know if it's a section or a division, or I always forget those terms, but yeah. So that's where the academic librarian stuff is.
Got it. And then how long has this framework sort of been in existence? Do you guys know?
Gosh, 2 or 3 years, I guess now. That's close, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, we had some standards before, and they were older and needed revision, and so this is what we have now. But I think it's interesting when you look at these, as I was sort of thinking about this to have this conversation today, I was sort of looking at the frames. And if you're interested, the website is there if you really want to know more. If you got to know, Google it up and see what you get. There's some interesting sort of, and we can talk a little bit more about them here in a second. But what's interesting about them to me is that all of these things in my head are always focused on a course assignment, a research project, a dissertation, a master's thesis, they're always an academic project. But for if you spend some time and sort of think it through, obviously, right, they apply to everybody and they apply in some way to all kinds of contexts. So I think that that's something that as academic librarians, at least for me, I need to remember that that's, happening in lots of different places and lots of different ways. And students are coming to us with experiences in school and public libraries that inform what they're doing. So.
And I also think the point that research as inquiry, can you talk a little bit about what that means in an academic setting?
Yeah. Research as inquiry is this idea that you don't do one search and then be done, right? That you start with a question. You don't start with, I wrote my paper, but I need some sources to put in the bibliography. It's this idea of like, you're asking a question, you're reading, you're synthesizing, you're asking other questions, and it kind of leads you, the research can kind of lead you down different paths. And so it's sort of a mindset for me anyway. That's how I think about it.
Well, and it's a way to find that research question where there's a gap in the research.
Yes.
It's sort of that reiterative process of forming the question, looking, shopping around, and redoing your question to where you can get to a point that, oh, this is going to add value to the literature, to the discipline.
See, and I think that's really different from where public libraries are sort of coming from, because a lot of times if a patron is coming in with, we would call it a reference question, there probably is one answer, or maybe there's sort of a range of answers, but the patron wants an answer. They don't necessarily want to go on a learning journey. Do you know what I mean?
That's an interesting point.
Yes,
yeah,
it is.
Definitely.
Because
I think our students don't want to go on learning journeys either.
Sometimes.
Sometimes I think what they want is, I just need 5 sources that say this. And so that's a hard one for me to sort of negotiate with them. So yeah.
But I wonder, in the public library, have they already done that inquiry process before they come to you? Have they realized, this is my question, after sort of mulling it about and, here's my situation, here's my question. Oh, that's not the way I need to approach it. Maybe has it taken place beforehand and we just haven't observed it? I don't know.
Well, and I think it could have, especially, like if the patron just found out they had diabetes at their doctor's office, and their doctor's office has given them a pamphlet, and maybe they've started by looking at that, and now they want some books on how to change their diet or something like that. So maybe they've sort of started thinking about that. But I don't know. I feel like for the public sometimes, and I don't mean to be insulting when I say this, but I feel like sometimes the questions that they're asking are a little more real. They're a little bit more applicable to their day-to-day life. And I'm also going to share a few things in the chat box. Rachel says that I think she's talking about research as inquiry. She thinks that's a big one with working with students, helping them think about research as something more involved than finding so many sources for a need, but rather thinking about how to engage as a researcher, searching for information to really address a problem or answer a question. And I really liked what you guys said about finding a hole in the literature that your paper or your project can then sort of help fill. And then Janine says that sometimes that does happen during a reference interview, which is what we call them in the public library. The original question might change as you're looking through the materials. And I would agree with that as well. Sometimes when you're having that conversation, it can sort of morph what the patron is really trying to come to an answer about. We have a couple other people typing as well. Can you tell us a little bit about scholarship as conversation? I don't know what that is at all.
I love this one. And I was just using it yesterday in an honors class. Students come to us and they've chosen a major, but what they don't realize is that there are scholars and researchers out there in their major who are publishing and doing research. And the way that they talk is not through Twitter, but it's through their research articles. And, every discipline has those journals and has those articles that are having that conversation by those researchers and experts in the discipline. So that's kind of how I present that.
Right. And so part of what they're learning is to be a part of that conversation in their own research,
and learn those journals.
And learn this is typically, at least for us here at Ball State, I talk about this with freshmen, but it really comes into play at a different level.
Well, I have to say that just made my mind kind of blow up because I think that's such a good analogy saying that they're talking through their research articles. I think that's really kind of amazing. So good job, guys.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, because
This is awesome at that one.
yeah, you are. I mean, I feel like you know,
Favorite.
almost any question is really going to have some different camps of answers too. I mean, even if we're talking about the diabetes question, you might have one doctor that says, well, this is, you should definitely fight it with good diet and exercise. You might have someone else that says you absolutely need these kinds of medicines, things like that. So those that information is having a conversation, and it's up to the patron to decide whether or not they're going to kind of engage in that and look at the whole thing, or whether or not they're going to stop their inquiry. That's really interesting. Vanessa, yeah, Vanessa says she also thinks patrons are used to looking in books as opposed to searching for articles. I'll guide patrons using, EBSCO to find their sources. And I'm actually going to circle back to something that you guys were talking about earlier, which was your discovery layer that you have at Ball State. So public libraries have this too, and it's called the Inspire databases. And they might not realize that, Inspire has a discovery layer on top of it, which is where we sort of aggregate all the databases that we have. And I think another point that I'm going to sort of echo what Vanessa is saying is that I used to work with teachers that would really require that the students they didn't necessarily say a book, but they would say you have to have a print resource. And I would send them back to school with an article printed out from Inspire that was originally published in a print journal, and the teacher would call me and say, no, this isn't a print resource.
We had that occasionally too, yeah.
And that just makes you want to put a staple in your head, you know what I mean?
It sure does. Or someone else's head.
Right, yeah, exactly. Sometimes. I mean, that's so frustrating because then it really is like, well, how can I, help educate this teacher? And I certainly don't want to be, disparaging to teachers at all. They have their work cut out for them. But I think it is important to see that, like, at a public library, sometimes our audience for these kinds of questions isn't just our patrons. It's also the teachers at the elementary school that we're working with. It's certainly parents as well. So we're working with kind of, I don't know, we're trying to train up, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to just mention, I don't know if any of you guys are watching Stranger Things, and I will not do any spoilers, but there was a really lovely little part in one of the episodes where one of the kids has a research question, and he goes to the library and is getting, some books to try to help answer his question. And, he's really like, this is my question, and I'm trying to find these answers, and he's really trying to find good data. So I thought that was really nice. Of course, from the 80s, so he's not looking in a database.
Right. Yeah. I haven't started the second season, but I will look for that when I do.
Yeah, you'll know it when you see it. Are there any other points that you wanted to make on the framework here, or are there any questions from anyone about what any of this sort of means just off the bat?
I don't think so. We can flip forward one slide, and we have just some concepts that we might talk about a little if there's time. I don't know what time it is.
We're at 10:45, so we still have, we can take up to 15 more minutes. So.
Oh, okay.
Well, I kind of came upon this as just an area to put down all these things that were jumbled in my head and see what you guys, how do you define them? What do they look like? What do they mean when you see threshold concept? Well, what is it? I mean, for me personally, the threshold concept, and I was talking to Lisa about that, and we decided, somebody can go through and understand a concept within a certain context, and then the same assignment or the same expectation is put on them, and the next time they won't get there, they won't get it, as we said earlier. And so what do we do? I mean, what does that look like for you in your settings?
And this is I will say that the idea of threshold concept is pretty controversial up here.
Yes.
In the academic, up here in Muncie, but also in the academic world too. So if you're not familiar, it's this whole idea of a concept that once you get it, you can't unget it, like, or you can move past and understand things in new ways.
So
it comes out of economics.
Can you give us a more concrete example of what that might be? I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
So, for example, maybe one would be once you understand that databases contain articles that were published in a journal, you think about them in a different way than you think about the internet, right? Mm-hmm. So once you kind of get that piece, it changes the way you look at that process. Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, there's a lot of things, like Brenda said. I mean, you can learn. I mean, how many times have you learned stuff over your life and gone, oh my God, I totally, how did I not see that? So I don't know. I mean, these are sort of squishy to me anyway.
And I think sometimes if you don't revisit something, I mean, clearly you're going to forget things, particularly things like, I don't know, capitals of countries, things like that. You might have known it at one point and then you sort of lose it. But I think that's different than understanding a concept, which might be like understanding the concept of a democracy. I feel like once you sort of understand that, it's hard to kind of unlearn that. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then once you can understand a democracy, maybe that might be a threshold to then going on a journey of understanding other different kinds of governments. Am I being too basic here?
No, that works well.
No, it works.
And that's a really good example too, because a lot of these things are contextual and they're in a discipline too. So sometimes it's hard. I think it's hard for me to always get them in a library setting. So
Rachel says that the threshold concept thing is not something they use a lot at Purdue. She likes to think about it as fundamental, big concepts that really help learners understand a discipline or a context. I think that helps me understand it too, is to think about it as, a large concept.
I like to think of it as a goal.
Yeah.
It's a goal for students to get to the point where they're comfortable creating a search in a specific database that matches their question. They may not get there. I may not see that, but it is still a goal. And once they know where to go to address their question, then they can't unknow that. So.
Although I guess I would say in the public world, we have people unknow things all the time. We just had I think I was transcribing a webinar recently that was talking about helping patrons with dementia, and I guess I know that's due to a physical ailment, but those kinds of things do happen where, you maybe had this great place in your life where you knew all this great stuff and you had a really rich life, and then that starts deteriorating as you get older. And I think for the publics, they see that side of it. They're trying to help patrons that used to be really good at something and now they can't do it any longer. So I don't know. I feel like we definitely have different challenges in working with a wide variety of people in the public. Not to, of course, again, not to say we're not doing the same things, because we certainly are, but we've got cradle to grave in public libraries.
Right, and that falls under that lifelong learning.
Yeah. Talk about dispositions a little bit.
Oh.
We're taking a big breath here. We would like students to have that part added to their being, have an affective or a positive attitude and value learning once they come through the whole information literacy experience. Now, goodness sakes.
And wouldn't that be an amazing ride at Kings Island? I think, for me, a disposition in this context tends to have to do with their attitude about what they're doing and the value that they see in doing the thing that they're doing. So whether it's a paper or a video project or a lesson plan or whatever, that they value this idea of, oh, there are these different sources, and it's a good idea to, kind of compare the information I find and that sort of thing. So the dispositions, for me, are more attitudinal.
I see.
Not so much like emotion, I guess, but more like yeah, this is a smart move on my part. This is a good thing for me to work on. Whereas those practices are, how do we know they're doing it? Ways that people demonstrate that they understand what it is that they need to be doing. So
I'm assuming that you guys don't really grade on dispositions.
No.
Right.
that's something that you can't really even see.
Right.
You just hope for it. You know, it's like the unicorn. You hope it's there because that would be really cool, right?
Right. And
But
I guess in a public library, this might be like the curiosity that a child might have.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Or just the desire to read and to go into the summer reading program or whatever. Like that's
Right.
a attitudinal, and it comes from obviously lots of places, your family, your whatever, your own sense of what you like to do. So
And since you mentioned summer reading, it's no secret that public librarians really try to change attitudes about summer reading by offering prizes, things like that.
yes, my sister was a children's librarian and a summer reading coordinator for years, and she was very creative about it, and I loved it as a kid. I'm a huge fan. But yeah, I don't have any problem with prizes.
Right.
I would give prizes if we were allowed to. I think it's amazing.
Jennifer says dispositions to her are what we want to become habits. She tells students that little habits make a big difference in their academic success, and she's at a high school. Oh, Jennifer, I'm so glad that you're here from a high school.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it too, as a habit. Yeah, I like that. I may steal that.
And I guess also, bringing it back to public libraries again, I think dispositions can be slightly different because their motivation to learn something might be different. And Jennifer says, steal away. So, like, motivations for colleges and universities, I think that may even vary student to student, because some students are like, I want to get the best grades possible so that I can get into, higher learning. Maybe I want to get a great job after college. Maybe I just want to take this class because there's, someone else in the class that I like, that I want to, hang out with or whatever. And then, maybe people really are interested in their field and they want to do some breakthrough research. So there's a whole variety of reasons why people would be learning things. But I think that they're really different from the public. In the public, it might be like, I really need to learn how to file for unemployment, or I really need to come up with a great program for my kids' Girl Scout meeting. I mean, there's a huge variety. I need to figure out, what to eat so that I don't die. I mean, there's a whole variety of different things.
The motivations are different, pretty much.
And I think that can affect your disposition as well.
I agree.
All right. So I think was that our last slide?
That is our last slide.
That's our last slide. So I guess the next thing in the next couple minutes, I don't want to, take us too late here, but if there are any takeaways or things that you gathered from this conversation, we'd be curious to know what they are.
Or if anyone has any questions too.
Or if anyone, if anyone has additional questions or something they want to share, throw it out there.
That sounds great. And I know this was a little bit of a different format than we normally do on our webinars, so I think this was really interesting way for our participants to kind of be learning about this today, is to really kind of participate in a conversation instead of having a lot of, information thrown at them. So it was a new experience for me, and I just want to thank you guys for giving us the opportunity. I don't see anybody chatting. Are there any final comments or questions people want to go ahead and share? And if you are at schools, we didn't really hear from, I know that Jennifer mentioned that she's from a school, but if there's any other thoughts of how information literacy works in a school setting, we'd be really interested in that too. So we've got a couple people typing. And I am going to go ahead and put your LEU up so that you can download that if you want, and I'll walk you through how to do that right now. All you have to do is click on the name of the file where it says Information Literacy 11.3-2017, and then your download file button will show up at the bottom there, and then you'll be able to follow the prompts to get it. But I would encourage you to go ahead and share or give us some comments before you do that. So again, we do have a couple people typing. And I'll also mention that I met Lisa and Brenda through a Academic Library of Indiana meeting, and academic libraries are really interested in information literacy. I'm glad we had this opportunity to do this.
Yeah.
So Janine says, I'm going to steal the idea of teaching how to make better searches by using familiar websites or even games. So choosing clothes and hair, etc. on a Roblox game. That's a great idea. Thanks for sharing that takeaway. Let's see what else. Got a couple more things. I do think the whole concept of information literacy is kind of squishy. I'm glad that you said that word. And I guess, I don't know, it seems squishy in a public library setting, but it also seems like you guys have really good ways of defining it in the academic side of things.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think every library kind of does it differently. And every librarian thinks about it differently, too. So,
yeah. Joseph says, I like the idea of research questions leading us down different research paths. I believe it was Brenda who said that. We don't see it as much in public libraries as patrons seem to want an answer rather than going on a journey, but I might try to encourage that when possible. I think that's just beautiful, of course.
Yeah. Journeys are good.
Yeah. And Rachel says that
she pathfinder.
That's right. Can you guys see the chat box now?
We can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Awesome. Okay, well, I feel like we're sort of at the end here. If anyone has any final comments or questions, go ahead and shoot them in the chat box. I want to thank Brenda and Lisa for being with us today, and I want to thank all of you guys for chiming in and sharing so much. I hope that you feel like you've learned something about information literacy today, or at least gave your brain a little bit of a workout. So thank you so much, guys. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. We can hang out in the room a couple more minutes to take a look at the chat box. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.